This title is not clickbait, I promise. Hand on heart, I would say the same thing to Gege Akutami himself, and there's a reason for that which I'll be going over in this video. This is also not going to be the kind of video where I provide a little character analysis as if to say, you don't get Ryomen Sukuna, but I do. I will analyze his character of course, but it won't end the way you think, so stick around until the end to find out. Hopefully with that short intro I've made it clear enough that people not understanding Ryomen Sukuna, myself included, is something I'll be treating as the actual premise of this video. Some may think, if I'm so convinced that we can't understand Sukuna, wouldn't that make any analysis I do in order to convey that point an exercise in futility? Good question, but here's the difference. What I'm saying is that we can't understand Ryomen Sukuna the person, but understanding that the character has been designed in such a fashion on purpose and for a purpose, recognizing that this inability to comprehend him is a feature his character writing exhibits is a different matter. We may not be able to understand Sukuna as a person, but understanding him as a character begins with that train of thought. Alright, now for the elaboration that I promised. What happens when the very embodiment of hedonism and complete freedom gets trapped in the body of a teenager? And what happens when he then breaks out? These are a pair of questions that chapter 212 and subsequent chapters answered, and that answer is almost disappointingly simple. Whatever the hell Sukuna wants, he will make happen. There has been a very noticeable tonal shift in the story after chapter 212 to the point that many, myself included, have coined this stretch Sukuna Kaisen. It feels like everything in the story exists to gas him up. All of those memes about Gege being a Sukuna glazer come from a pretty understandable place. The way this character has been presented is sublime. He gets special privilege in framing above everybody else. Satoru Gojo, who had consistently been written as the arrogant, self-confident pinnacle of the verse, personally confirmed Sukuna's superiority over him, and then Sukuna proceeded to pick off the cast one by one. Hell, the narrative itself gasses him up. There's a reason the death of Satoru Gojo, the one man who forcibly stood on the same stage as the King of Curses, is treated like the death of just an ordinary man by the narrative. Let's quickly recap how the end of Gojo vs Sukuna went down. An attack that was seen by neither the character that was targeted nor the audience, us readers, followed by a brief sequence of introspection in their mindscape, and lastly a scene of the aftermath with their mutilated body. Who else died like this? Jogo and Toji. Ordinary guys, that's who. Neither of them could reach the heights that Gojo or Sukuna occupied. They are what you get when you maximize the strength of ordinary people who aren't able to get to that next level, and Gojo himself was demoted to a similar position to those two, just before Kashimo came in to fight Sukuna, leaving zero breathing room for the death of the most beloved character this story has had to offer. In fact, one of the most recent chapters, which confirmed Sukuna was a twin and cannibalized his sibling in the womb, elevates Sukuna in the narrative as well. This isn't the first example of twins in this story. Maki had hit an agonizing plateau in her strength because Mai didn't want to get stronger. Twins are treated as a single being by cursed energy. Sukuna rejected this fate by simply eating his twin. Not only is he the ultimate sorcerer with his body optimized for Jujutsu, he's also presented to have a type of strength that's 100% divorced from Jujutsu. Besides the rejection of fate by eating his twin, Sukuna using the air as a footing despite explicitly not being able to fly strengthens this point further. This is something we've also seen from Maki that is specifically tied to her heightened senses, an ability that is completely divorced from Jujutsu. All of this hype in just 50 chapters, but what if I were to tell you that this was the case even before the aforementioned tonal shift? With a couple key differences obviously, but even before Sukuna regains agency, the narrative had built itself around his existence. The story starts with him. He is the object of everyone's missions in the series, protagonists and antagonists alike. His philosophy of strength and being are treated as correct by the narrative, and anything conflicting with it is shut down. I've spoken about this in depth in previous videos, so let me throw in a clip here. Never mind that, I just realized that clip would be like 7 minutes long, so if you want to hear that, go to this timestamp of my Gojo vs Sukuna video in the description below. Tengen looking like Sukuna is not a coincidence. In universe, I don't know, Gege may very well do something with that, but from a narrative perspective, meaning can already be derived from this detail. The fact that the emblem of the archaic Jujutsu Order herself takes after Sukuna in appearance is massively significant to the point I'm making. That point being, this was always Sukuna Kaisen. Everything in this story works around Ryomen Sukuna. When it comes to narrative significance, framing and presentation, Sukuna reigns supreme over every single character in this story. He is number one. He is what the story is framed around, and there would be no Jujutsu Kaisen without him. But let's not be fooled by all of Gege's supposed glazing. Let's see Sukuna for what he really is. A parasite. He doesn't belong in this era. He takes over other people's bodies and wholly depends on them to even be able to exist. That isn't to say there's any contradictory characteristics here. Sukuna can simultaneously be self-serving and depend on others. Why? Because his dependence is forceful and purely concerned with usefulness. Sukuna's parasitism is him being true to himself. He never once pretends otherwise. With that said, it may appear odd that the story seems to turn away from this reading of his character. The thing is, it doesn't. The only reason why it feels like it does is because the story doesn't engage with the usual negative connotation that parasitism carries. After all, it's who Sukuna is. Sukuna's parasitism is not limited to him forcefully taking Megumi's body and working alongside the only other parasite in the story to emerge in the current era. It also manifests in how he steals other characters' narrative roles. One of the most obvious instances of what I'm talking about is how Sukuna takes over Megumi's body and fights Gojo in it. This fulfills the theme of cyclicality in JJK, in how the ancient feud between the Gojo and Zenin clan's heads is reenacted in the modern era. This is something that a lot of people who had caught onto how obsessed the story is with reenacting cycles had theorized could happen, long before Megumi's body was hijacked by Sukuna. After all, the story we've been reading since the end of the Shibuya incident is quite literally the reenactment of the Heian era. But rather than Megumi himself, it was the King of Curses who brought about this cycle by hijacking Megumi's body and abilities and using that body and those abilities to kill Satoru Gojo. Gege having Megumi become the head of the Zenin clan was specifically for this purpose, for his role to be hijacked by Sukuna. Secondly, there is Mahito's role of being the antithesis of Yuji. I spoke about this in one of my previous videos, which you should definitely check out after this because it contains some Sukuna analysis that I won't be covering here, but let me lay down a particular part of that video again. As far as Yuji is concerned, both Mahito and Sukuna play the same functional role. They both challenge his hero complex on a deep, intimate level. They both kill one of Yuji's mentors each. They both kill one of Yuji's friends each. And they both disable, for lack of a better term, one of Yuji's friends each, leaving their respective statuses very questionable. Pretty much one-to-one. Gege can be kinda obsessive when enforcing these parallels. Thirdly, Gojo was specifically created by Gege to serve as the indisputable power ceiling of the world, but it is Sukuna that exemplifies the heights of Jujutsu on various occasions. He introduced us to the concept of domain expansions only a few chapters before Jogo and Gojo could, and then introduced us once again to the next level of domains, the open barrier domain expansion during the Shibuya incident. In fact, Sukuna is consistently the pinnacle that Gojo could reach only a couple of times throughout the series, characterized by the euphoric high he experiences whilst facing strong opponents. This is why the Honored One epithet was given to Sukuna by the narrative itself, whereas Gojo proclaimed himself to be the Honored One. And last but definitely not least, as this is probably the quintessential example, Yuji has the goal of guiding people to quote-unquote proper deaths. However, one could say that he's consistently failed to do so. On the other hand, Sukuna has engaged in 6 or so drawn-out battles and has come out of each of them the victor. Yet, at the end of these battles, he's left all of his opponents satisfied in death. Jogo's worth was affirmed in death. Yorozu's love was realized in death. Gojo's identity crisis was resolved in death. Kashimo's dilemma was answered in death. Higuruma found absolution in death. And the latest example is Choso, who died fulfilling his duty as a big brother whilst acting as a human with complete agency. And all of this comes from engaging in combat with Sukuna. He effortlessly, unintentionally achieves what Yuji has been trying to do since the start of the story. Of course, this does have a lot of room for differing interpretations. Yuji has been instrumental in ending the pain of multiple transfigured humans, of Eso and Kechizu who suffered as a result of Choso's choice to live as curses, of Higuruma who was beating himself up for his crimes, of Choso who similarly was plagued with guilt. You can pretty confidently assert that Yuji has not really failed in his goal at all. Furthermore, it's not even confirmed if Higuruma is really even dead or not, but to be honest, that changes very little about my point. Whether or not he is alive, it is still thanks in major part to Sukuna that he could successfully exonerate an innocent person in trial for the first time in what seemed to be ages and find absolution at all. Giving people peace, almost like a blessing, is very deity-like. Like I've discussed in various videos, Sukuna is represented as a deity throughout the story in little but significant ways such as this. A lot of the information we have on Sukuna that came prior to chapter 212, that is prior to Sukuna gaining agency, comes from sources other than himself. As such, his intent in these representations until that key chapter is a non-factor. I'm obviously excluding the moments where he hijacked Yuji's body like in Shibuya. What a lot of people don't realize is that this is actually a very important distinction, because there's a lot of nuance to be found in how the narrative represents Sukuna versus how he carries himself. The foremost example is something I've already talked about, that being how Gojo's death was treated by the narrative. There was a pointed similarity to how the other quote-unquote ordinary guys died in Jujutsu Kaisen before. Also, that Sukuna's statement that Gojo was an ordinary, unenlightened whatever could be validated. The narrative wants to side with Sukuna. I believe this is the reason Gojo didn't receive the special treatment in his death that I and many other fans may have thought he deserved. It is a painfully normal send-off by Jujutsu Kaisen standards. However, Sukuna himself is independent of the narrative. He has been so since chapter 212. Regardless of how the narrative paints it, the real picture is of Sukuna being immensely moved by Gojo, to the point that he said he'd remember the name of the person he called a nameless fish like 15 minutes prior for as long as he lived. This feature of Sukuna's is something you can see even with the most basic building block of his character, perception. How he is perceived as opposed to what he actually is. How the dichotomy manifests very literally, and how that is the defining feature of the two distinct acts of the story, that is pre-212 and post-212. It all comes back to this, Sukuna's independence from everything, including the narrative that serves him. There is something to be said about how it seems like Sukuna doesn't care about how he's perceived. He was fine with looking like a loser for most of his fight with Gojo, 13 chapters straight, as long as he got that one final decisive hit off. Not saying that it was a lucky shot, but rather that his patience in playing the long game surpasses any need to look good. As a matter of fact, he never displays any need to look good before others. He didn't feel the need to take Jogo's suggestion and make a binding vow with Yuji to take control of his body. He was absolutely fine with letting everybody think Yuji could keep him in check for the longest time until his trap was sprung and he broke free and gained a massive arsenal in one go. Sukuna is his own measure of strength, of worth, of everything. Not even the Buddha himself is a worthy yardstick for Sukuna in this story. It was the narrative that gave him the honored one epithet that the Buddha once gave himself. Sukuna doesn't give a toss about it. He doesn't make statements like this. The only reason he called himself the fallen or the disgraced one in that one chapter is because they were talking about who is it, and he was like, yeah, it's me. He never once claimed even the King of Curses title. These are all impositions, either made by the other characters in the story or the narrative itself through the use of narration. Yet despite all of this, we can very clearly see Sukuna's own efforts in portraying himself as a deity, or at the very least some sort of a superhuman figure. In chapter 259 we can see just what kind of reliance Sukuna places on binding vows. As a matter of fact, one of the most blatant pointers of his godhood, his divine domain, is also completely a result of binding vows. As the King of Curses, the prototype of the optimization of cursed energy, he needs to contract with the very energy he's supposed to be the overlord of in order to obtain a thing that would act as a pointer to his divinity. There's nothing divine about a contract, especially since the binding obligations shackle the potency of whoever it's binding upon. What's interesting is how we can't really tell whether the intention on Sukuna's part is to be construed as a divine being or just to maximize his abilities. After all, we very recently saw what Kamino, or the furnace, is capable of when activated within his default domain. At first glance, the answer seems very obvious. Surely there's no way that after seeing Kamino, one could say that this isn't the primary reason Sukuna opted for a domain with incredible range. But the answer gets less and less obvious the more you consider the other instances of such duality. Let's start with something as mundane as his clothes. Gege said Sukuna wears women's clothes because they generally feature wider sleeves, which made it easier for him to move his double arms in his Heian form. However, he wears them in the Yuji form too. Why? Probably a trivial thing to question, but here are my thoughts. Sukuna is considered by people in some regions as an incarnation of the Bodhisattva canon. I'll leave a link to the source in the description. A Bodhisattva deity isn't bound by gender. This applies to Lady Canon especially, since one of her other incarnations is male, a deity called Lord Avalokiteshvara. That took like 30 tries to say. But yeah, the fact that Sukuna's most important title is Ryomen, meaning two-faced, comes into play in many more ways than just describing the weird flesh mask on his face. Two-faced most commonly refers to a dichotomy. In the context of Sukuna, it is something that extends to his embodiment of the previously discussed dichotomy. It's almost like a condition to fulfill. Sukuna transcends notions of gender, which he probably views as petty. He doesn't treat Yorozu any differently from his male opponents. Urame's gender is like the most irrelevant thing about them to Sukuna. All that matters is how they can be of use to him. There's also yet another legend that has evidentiary value in this discussion. As per an ancient Greek legend, humans were once fused together, male and female, in a single body. It was 2 faces, 4 arms, and 4 legs in one body. Each male was paired with his female soulmate. With happiness and love thus inherent, the humans displayed a kind of strength that the gods of Olympus were wary of, and so Zeus one day decided to split every human in half, thus separating man and woman forever. With that love that previously came naturally, now foreign, humankind was less of a threat as they were now preoccupied searching for the missing piece of themselves, their soulmate. This legend has so many ties to Sukuna. The physical appearance itself aside, the fact that in the legend, the appearance was thanks to man and woman being fused together supports the male-female dichotomy that I previously mentioned. Furthermore, it was because they were fused to their soulmate that love was inherent to mankind. However, Sukuna's body, which has double features similar to the ancient Greek humans who even threatened gods, it's all him. There's no better pointer to his philosophy of self-satisfaction. Sukuna says he knows love. Love for himself trumps all else. The extreme end of this idea is greed, which is again symbolized by doubling his own limbs. So was the weird body arrived at to symbolize his self-satisfaction? Obviously not, when the narration basically explains how it's meant to be a maximization of his jujutsu, right? Then again, it's just as obvious that his body resembles that of a Hindu or Buddhist deity as I previously mentioned. So then, which is it? What part is intentional on Sukuna's part? Keep in mind that all this cannot be attributed to the narrative's gimmicks like the framing of Gojo's death can. This is all Sukuna, this is all coming from him. No one else has had a hand in all these dualistic representations. Almost everything about him is to the end of practicality and usefulness, while still carrying divine representations. The final point, which has me convinced that the divine interpretations carry equal weight as the practical side does, is his speech. It has been emphasized time and time again that Sukuna speaks like an aristocrat. This is most evident in the aftermath of his fight with Gojo. His "you are magnificent" line in Japanese transliterates to "you cleared my skies." He waxes poetic every chance he gets. He's even canonically knowledgeable about haiku, a form of poetry in Japan. The interesting thing about this is how it's hinted that he's not actually a born aristocrat. He was an unwanted, cursed child, starving in the womb itself, calling his mother poor, all of which indicating that he was born into poverty. Keep in mind, we're talking about the Heian era when Japanese national culture was still undergoing the process of consolidation to a relatively meager degree, and the aristocrats, who constituted the vast majority of the literates in the country, still used Chinese characters in their literary works. If a kid was born into poverty, tough chance he turns out speaking the way Sukuna does. There's a reason Sukuna carries himself the way he does, and we're not privy to it, but the way he carries himself suggests his adherence to an external yardstick. We can see that he tries to be perceived as a deity. This is not to mention all the instances in the series where he just blatantly has that divine aura, by the way. This isn't a binary in the sense that it's either Sukuna being portrayed as a deity or it's Sukuna trying to be perceived as one. Nor is it the case that any kind of intentionality on Sukuna's part in this matter makes him fraudulent in any way. I think the most interesting way that Jujutsu Kaisen showcases this is how Sukuna's actions carry immense significance from a meta perspective. His domain, for instance, which is said to be akin to painting on air, creates slashes that act as the paneling and sound effects of the page. Painting on air is the ability to affect the fabric of reality itself. I did say that he's independent of the narrative, so it stands to reason that there's interactivity between Sukuna and the fabric of reality, in this case, the fabric that makes up the manga. Other instances are the more common techniques of meta storytelling in the manga medium, where a character will look straight at the reader as they talk about some key information. Sukuna addresses humanity as a whole as he looks at the reader and says, "Know your place, you who don't know anything." Yes, that's what this panel actually translates to. I'm sure in the context of this video, you can hazard a guess as to just why he's telling us we don't know anything or what we're even unaware about. I'm doubly sure of this interpretation because Mahito is described to be the mirror of humanity in the manga, who is the only other person he was talking to in that scene. A very similar scene takes place when Sukuna's little eye looks at the reader as he says humanity should live with their heads down, coping with their weakness. He says this to Yuji, who also plays the role of a mirror of humanity by way of him reflecting hopes and dreams of other characters within the series. Things like this make it very hard to contend that Sukuna is anything but divine. Despite all of this complex characterization where we need to carefully sift through all his representations to arrive at something cohesive, Sukuna's actual motivation is so simple that the contrast between his construction as a character and his motives is almost jarring. Hedonism is one of the simpler philosophies. It's a stance that argues pleasure and happiness are the highest good and the primary aim of human life. It suggests that individuals should seek pleasure and avoid pain in all aspects of their existence. This pursuit of pleasure can manifest in various forms, including physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual pleasures. Everything about Sukuna fits this philosophy to a T. For starters, the story says it's only his pleasure and displeasure that exist. It quite simply points to how his moral compass operates on maximizing pleasure. What causes him pleasure and displeasure determines the rightness and wrongness of an act or omission respectively. This is something that, by way of Sukuna's status in the narrative, or rather in the eyes of the narrative, extends to the series as a whole, since characters that emulate Sukuna in action and intention are rewarded and vice versa. That bit about maximization of pleasure being his sole drive isn't to say that Sukuna is driven by his id. That describes Mahito better than it does Sukuna. Sukuna is actually far more aligned to the reality principle that governs the ego as per Freudian psychoanalysis. He can sit still locked up inside his host body for months straight. He can take ridiculous hits and still stick to his plan of attack that requires him to stay in his Megumi form that quite visibly has a hand-to-hand disadvantage instead of switching to his Heian form, which could potentially mitigate that, albeit at the cost of keeping his level of Jujutsu stagnant. What I mean to say is, he has never encountered a situation that is displeasing and immediately tried to change it or lash out in a spinal reflex kind of way. He is entirely focused on maximizing his pleasure, and if that takes waiting or even suffering for a while, then so be it. This is the furthest thing from Mahito, who breaks down like the baby he is the instant things stop going his way. This is a relatively simple philosophy and it's just perfect for his character. The way the complexity of his construction is offset by the simple philosophy he lives by is fantastic, to say the least. Not only because the contrast makes the reading experience more immersive and just better on the palate, but also because the very simple philosophy is what gives the incredibly complex construction any kind of point. Now, what if I told you that it's exactly this incredibly easy to understand philosophical concept that paradoxically stops us from being able to understand Sukuna? As a matter of fact, paradoxically is just the right word to use because it has been widely accepted by academia that hedonism just isn't a sustainable philosophy if unregulated. Let's briefly discuss the paradox of hedonism. It refers to the practical difficulties encountered in the pursuit of pleasure. For the hedonist, constant pleasure seeking may not yield the most actual pleasure or happiness in the long term, when consciously pursuing pleasure interferes with experiencing it. This paradox is kind of a common understanding that spans across various different eras of thinkers. Everybody from Aristotle to the father of utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill, or even anime Twitter's favorite philosopher, Nietzsche. When pleasure itself is the goal, there's nothing that awaits you besides frustration. There's a good chance that you watching this are not a philosopher, and this goes without saying, but neither am I. But we both can still conceptualize how and why one's aim is frustrated when one's aim is solely towards pleasure itself. It may be an expectation versus reality problem. It may be that because pleasure as a goal isn't measurable or quantifiable, one can't say for sure whether the goal was achieved. It may be numerous other things. This is all quite simple, stuff that we've grown up hearing, stuff that wouldn't even constitute a philosophy starter pack. It is because it is so universally applicable that it's been a common understanding in the zeitgeist of different eras of philosophy. But this paradox that is almost ubiquitous in the exploration of hedonism doesn't look like it applies to Sukuna. He is beyond it. I don't know how else to describe it. He was straight up asked if his pursuit of pleasure doesn't get boring. Textbook symptom of the paradox. And he says no. And if you don't get it, you don't get it. Who could transcend the limitation on the pursuit of pleasure that you could call intrinsic to humanity as a whole, if not someone that's more than human? In Jujutsu Kaisen, this inhumanness is what distinguishes Sukuna from the rest of the cast, and what elevates him to the position of a deity. And I know I sound like I'm about to start chanting like this soon, but all I'm doing is presenting what I see in the manga, and what I see is a very clear divide between Sukuna and the rest of the cast from the rest of humanity as a whole, with the basis of the divide being something extremely fundamental to our constitution. We can never bridge this gap I've described. We can never rationalize or resonate with Sukuna's mentality fully. The only other person in the series who occupied the same position as Sukuna in the narrative experienced crushing loneliness and explicitly verbalized how it always felt like others were a whole different species in comparison to him. The people around Gojo could never understand him. The fact that Gojo was locked in the prison realm where he was alone with nothing but his own thoughts for an immeasurable amount of time, stuck in limbo, and came out exactly the same as he was before, speaks to this. He literally compares his experience in the prison realm to an insanely busy week of work as the strongest Jujutsu sorcerer. There is no kind of solitude that could be forced upon him that he already didn't feel. But Sukuna embraces this solitude and revels in it, another mark of how inhuman he is, and another mark of the divide between him and us. Unless this gap, which presents itself on so many fronts in so many ways, is bridged, how can we hope to truly understand Sukuna when even Gojo and Kashimo couldn't? Even the nigh omniscient narrator who is privy to the thoughts and feelings of different characters sometimes trips up when it comes to Sukuna. For all her omniscience, which admittedly reaches far enough that she understood how nervous Sukuna felt during the final stretch of his battle with Gojo, she couldn't understand Sukuna's strategies during the fights. When Gojo questions why Sukuna isn't using 10 shadows early on in the fight, there's an inconspicuous detail on the page. It's a narration box that overlaps with Gojo's own thoughts, as if the narrator herself is also echoing Gojo's question. This then leads into Sukuna himself having to explain the attack that took out Gojo, whereas previously it would either be narrated or it would be Kusakabe or someone else from the commentator panel explaining it. Keep in mind that the narrator is not just privy to characters' thoughts and feelings, but also to events that happen in the future. Even so, Sukuna himself is required to explain the world slash. If that isn't the perfect pointer to his divinity and incomprehensible nature, I don't know what is. Another cool pointer is the design choice made whenever there's narration about Malevolent Shrine. The narration boxes are superimposed over the domain, rather than blocking out a section of the page like they always do. Sukuna is the only character with whom this design choice is consistently made. When considered in tandem with what I previously said about the slashes of Sukuna's domain forming the paneling and sound effects of the page itself, and how the domain has the meta function of affecting the fabric that makes up the manga, this piece of information makes the point that even the narrator isn't above Sukuna's techniques. At best, the narration boxes can coexist with Sukuna. They can't be above him. After all, the narrative itself serves him. Remember, I also spoke about there being a distinction in how Sukuna presents himself and how the narrative presents him. This distinction wouldn't exist if the narrative understood him. Everything I introduced the video with is coming full circle. I promised to explain why I would tell Gege Akutami himself that even he doesn't understand a character he personally created. Here you go. Gege is a human, just like you and me. We can academically understand concepts like deification, hedonism, and whatnot. We can present them artistically on a canvas like Gege has and many storytellers before him have, but what we can't do is relate to them, internalize them, and emulate them. We are incapable of doing so as humans. True understanding comes from being able to walk in someone else's shoes. I'm not talking out of my ass here, by the way. For instance, Shoko understood that Gojo was lonely. Can anyone say with seriousness that she understood Gojo himself? The answer is no, because she could never walk in Gojo's shoes. This is why I strongly believe that the primary building block of Sukuna's character writing that everything else sits upon is that he is a person written to not be understood by anybody. There is a caveat to this video essay though. When you trace the events of the story as they've unfolded from chapter 1 till date, it's undeniable that we understand more of Sukuna as time passes. We get more context into his past, what shapes his personality, what drives him, etc. Even though I maintain we still can't understand him, he was undeniably much more of an enigma in Shibuya than he is right now. Yuji is actually reflective of this fact in a meta sense, as he, the mirror of humanity within the story and our lens into the world of JJK, becomes more and more like Sukuna. What with him using Shrine and getting those rings in his pupils, the more we come to understand Sukuna. And perhaps by the end of the story, we will be able to fully understand him, although I very much doubt Gege will take it all the way. Another key point of interest is the black box paneling feature employed when Sukuna recalls his own words. I made a whole video about this particular feature and what it means, go check that out if you haven't, but basically if words as recalled by a character are presented in a black panel, it's indicative of a curse placed on them by whoever spoke those words. So in this case, it presents the hypothesis that Sukuna's mentality is a self-imposed curse. Not only does that put Sukuna squarely within the rules of cursed energy, it also suggests that the mentality he subscribes to isn't something too far out of reach either. A curse is something we can truly understand. It's something every character in Jujutsu Kaisen can understand. Furthermore, the contradiction I mentioned a minute ago with respect to Sukuna and how he desires to be perceived may not be a contradiction at all. We all remember when Sukuna compared Mahoraga to the legendary Shinto figure Yamato no Orochi, who in mythology is an 8-headed serpent / dragon that was slain by the deity Susanoo. In Jujutsu Kaisen, he was very likely a sorcerer. Sukuna in real life was worshipped as a deity in what's currently the Gifu prefecture, and he's a sorcerer. The Hindu deity Lord Ganesh was a cursed spirit under Kenjaku's control. The deified historical figure Sugawara no Michizane is said to have been a vengeful spirit in Jujutsu Kaisen. Local land deities are cursed spirits in Jujutsu Kaisen as well. All of these deities from legends are all either sorcerers or cursed spirits in the ethos of Jujutsu Kaisen. As such, it's not so much an external measure of divinity that Sukuna adheres to, as it is a measure that was created ex post facto. He may be the origin of that measure himself. The measure of divinity was created with Sukuna, among others, in mind. Of course, this still doesn't take away from the dualistic representations. All it does is hint at there being more context to said representations we're missing that we're bound to find out as the series progresses. Think back to all the points I made. Maybe Sukuna was actually born into aristocracy, contrary to what I said. Maybe he wasn't actually starving in the womb because his family was poor. The whole thing about calling his mother poor is a kind of differential way of speaking. The true meaning doesn't actually imply anything about Sukuna's financial status, rather the formal manner of speech only further strengthens the idea that he was always an aristocrat. Maybe he was hungry in the womb because he just was. We're missing pieces of the story. That is, among other things, what's stopping us from truly understanding Sukuna the person. In my opinion, the construction of Sukuna is such that he is a puzzle to be put together, and we get more and more of the pieces as time passes. Before we have a piece in hand, any interpretation is fair. The best example I can think of to substantiate the puzzle analogy is the death visions experienced by Jogo and Kashimo. For the longest time, I believed that they were all fake, like the two of them imagined them up. I believed Sukuna wasn't part of them, and my justification made sense considering the information we had at that point. You can watch my Gojo vs Sukuna video if you want to hear what that was. But a new puzzle piece arrived in the form of confirmation that Sukuna was in fact part of those visions, and then another piece in the form of Sukuna not really understanding the ideals that they sharpened and threw at him in their respective fights, culminating in the visions. Both pieces of information recontextualized those visions and forced many people, including myself, to reassess our interpretation of Sukuna. And we are bound to receive many more such puzzle pieces. Until then, the fact of the matter is, you don't understand Ryomen Sukuna, and nor do I. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.